Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group on LinkedIn, which, as of this recording, has 284,000 members worldwide. And among those 284,000 people, Rob is one of my favorites. I say that unabashedly. I discovered him 3 years ago in the group, just one of the members, and he contributed so frequently with so much good information that I had to find out who is this guy. And subsequently, we became fast friends. He's attended every 10X conference we've held as a speaker. And every time he speaks, people listen and they chase him afterward and they want to work with him. So welcome to today's webinar. I'll put myself on mute. I'll be looking at your questions on the back end, and I'll chime in from time to time. In the meanwhile, Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. First point of business here, as Joe said, I am already getting a lot of requests for information, questions, can I have slide decks, things like that. Yes, the slide deck will be available to everybody, the recording will be available to everybody, but if you have specific questions that you want to ask that you don't want the whole world to hear, don't hesitate to call me at the number at the bottom of the screen. That's a Google Voice number, so I get it by text, email, and phone all at the same time. Or you can email me. I'm going to process the stuff from this webinar with preference. And so please put 510K tips in the subject line. It'll make it a whole lot easier for me to sort through these in a batch. And I suspect we'll have a lot of duplicate questions, or at least very similar questions, so some of those will end up as future blogs or future topics for our QARA weekly announcements that we do. But I have expanded the back end of my business. I have Medical Device Academy as a consulting firm, and I've got a lot of independent consultants that are working for me, some of them ex-FDA people that worked in the Office of Device Evaluations reviewing 510K submissions. So you get the real pros working with me. But in addition to that, I've got some additional people that I'm bringing on both to help me handle the calls and emails in a batch mode. But in addition to that, I'm also going to be bringing on somebody full-time in the very near future here, because it's the only way to handle this new volume of work, because this is very exciting. My expertise personally, I actually not only have done 510K submissions, but I've also done a ton of CE marking submissions. So one of the things I specialize in is helping companies do both submissions simultaneously, and I wrote a blog about that recently. If you want to do a 510K submission for the US and you want to do a CE marking submission for Europe and you want to do them at the same time, that can easily be done, and you can actually save yourself about 35% on the amount of workload that's required by planning it up front in specifically designing some of the sections so they can be used in both continents. So that's something you might want to be taking a look at, and I provide a link at the end to where you can find my blogs, and you can find that one pretty easily. It was a recent one. Anyway, today's webinar is going to be an overview of 510K submissions. It's impossible to cover every single thing you need to know about a 510K in one blog, two blogs, one webinar, two webinars, even three webinars. I've decided the way I'm going to do it is I break it down into little tiny pieces, and I make that a subject of a blog and make that subject of a webinar. So I have one just on the indications for use. That's section 4 of your submission. It's just one form. It's form 3881. That whole form that only has 4 sections to it gets an entire webinar and blog. That's how important it is. It's the first thing I work on. And I'll discuss that a little bit more here, but there's so much to learn about 510Ks. For a long time I was worried, do you want to tell everybody everything you know about 510Ks? And I realized unless they don't sleep and they're addicted to this, they'll never learn it all. So the more they learn, the more they're going to need help, and the more they're going to want help. So I freely share everything I know with people, and I try to write blogs and webinars whenever I can and help people. And what I find is the people that really have the tough challenges and have really cool projects that they're working on, those are the ones that call me, and they call me and ask for help, and I love helping them. I love working on the projects. I always get interested in the really exciting stuff, the new technologies that are on the cutting edge and nobody quite knows how to handle it. So if you got a challenge for me, please shoot me an email, 510K tips in the subject line, and you'll get a quick response. So here we go with the presentation. It's going to be about 1 hour long, and I'm sure we'll run a little bit over with a quick Q&A. So here's the agenda. We're going to cover a brief introduction, step-by-step predicate selection. It's going to be fairly abbreviated because I have a whole entire webinar I did this morning on predicate selection. Some strategic considerations on choosing your predicates, what to do when you can't identify a predicate. Then we get into substantial equivalence. That's the whole concept behind a 510K submission. You're trying to show your device is substantial equivalent to something else that's already on the market. We talk about a guidance document the FDA released last July, and the new flowchart that they're using includes 6 key questions, and we'll cover those 6 key questions. And then I talk about 510K project management, and this is probably the part that you'll enjoy the most because, sorry, I think I have something recorded there that shouldn't be. So when you get into project management of 510K, you get to see how my consulting firm manages projects. And that's not something every consulting firm shares, but I share it because you can duplicate exactly what I do without too much trouble. It's really powerful to learn how a consulting firm that's managing multiple 510Ks, sometimes as many as a dozen of them at once, can manage all those and make sure they get done in a timely manner and make sure we have multiple consultants organized, and we do things in batch. We have one person specializing on a topic, so you'll see some of that. And you can also learn how to predict how long it's going to take to prepare the submission, how long it's going to take to get it through the clearance process, and what some of the pitfalls are going to be. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So here's the overall timeline that the FDA publishes for their targets to complete a 510K. This is by congressional. This is a congressional requirement. They have to have specific targets that they have to hit, and they have to report to Congress how are we doing against those targets, and their funding is based on how they perform. It's all quantitative. They submit out an annual report, and they tell where they're falling down, what's working, what's not, and they make improvements. Back in December of 2012, they made a substantial change, and they introduced the concept of refusal to accept. It's a checklist process where they pre-screen all submissions to make sure they're worthy of even a reviewer touching it. So that happens in the first 15 days of every submission. But before that even gets to that person, the first thing that happens is they have to receive an e-copy. So in the olden days, back in the 90s, you would actually submit paper copies, 2 paper copies. Now, they keep the antiquated paper copy system, but now you only have to submit 1 paper copy, which I'm pretty sure nobody ever reads. Ex-FDA Office of Device Evaluations person that was out at 10X, Allison Komiyama, she said, no, we don't even read that. We just go right to the electronic copy. And the electronic copy, it can be a CD, it can be a flash drive, but what they do is they plug it into their system and they automatically upload it. It's all automatic, and if it fails in any of the automatic functions, it generates an automatic hold letter as well. So it tells you you screwed up, you didn't follow the instructions carefully enough, and your submission is on hold because we can't process it. The other reason why you get a hold letter is, sorry, your payment wasn't processed. We have your submission, we've uploaded it, but we don't have your money. So until we have your money, it's on hold. Once you pass those 2 obstacles, that's when you get into the RTA review. Now, those first 2 obstacles, if you pay a little bit in advance, just a few days in advance, that will clear ahead of time. You submit your e-copy. If you've gone through using some of the tools to make sure the e-copy is formatted correctly, they have tools to help you with that. It'll generate a file, it'll be great, it'll upload with no problem, and within 24 to 48 hours, you will know, yes, it's been accepted, and here's your K number. That doesn't mean you have clearance, it just means this is the file that we're reviewing. Now they have 15 days from the date that they received it, both the money and the e-copy, 15 days to review it and say whether it meets our minimum criteria for an acceptable submission. Then, and you usually get that confirmation at about day 14, right at the deadline. Then it goes into a review process. Now, that'll go for about up to the 60-day point, so another 45 days. And at that point, they're going to make a decision whether it's going to be interactive review or a request for additional information. If it's interactive review, that's fantastic news, because that means The reviewer that's looking at your file, they think that they can have a final decision on your 510K within 30 days. That is fantastic news to management. So interactive review, break open a bottle of champagne because you're 30 days from the goal line. If it's a request for additional information, hopefully you're prepared to submit something exactly what they want as quickly as you can so you don't have them stop the clock very long, because they can stop the clock anytime they ask for additional information. And that's why when the FDA says it takes 90 days and you see it takes like 120 days, that's the difference. They stop the clock and they're waiting for you. You can also stop the clock if you get an RTA letter. So they went through their checklist, they said it wasn't worthy, they stopped the clock, and that one's the worst because it goes back to 0. So you've just wasted 14, 15 days, and when you resubmit with the things that were missing, they start back at 1. They have 14 days more to review, and if they pass the RTA checklist the second time through, then you could get back in a queue. So a lot of things go at least to 105 days, and usually there's some additional requests for information that take another week or two. So a lot of submissions are out there around 125, 130 days. If they get to the 100-day, by their count, they have to respond and say they've missed their decision date, and they very, very, very rarely ever submit out that letter. So they're going to try to stop the clock in any way they can to hit their goals and request for additional information. And so if you respond quickly, you don't stop the clock very long, and you should be pretty close to that 120, 130 days for the entire process. This link at the top, and you're going to see hyperlinks throughout my entire presentation, and we'll use a little pointer here. So right up here is the hyperlink. That gives you the hyperlink to the guidance document on the RTA process. So the FDA has a refusal to accept process. You can see there's many, many pages to this, and there are yes or no questions and non-applicable and comments that the reviewer will put in. But the really experienced veterans, they actually include a copy of this completed for the reviewer right in the submission. They'll either put it right up front in section 1, or they'll put it very far in the back is section 21 is miscellaneous. But they're going to put it in there and they're going to answer all the questions, and it's really important that you answer those questions, because you're going to find some of the things that you just think are obvious are not so obvious to the FDA, and you really have to make sure you answer them. And including a copy of the checklist completed for the reviewer allows them to see where they can find it, and they can get through that RTA process much faster and without any hold letters to you that will cost you 15 days. Here's the #1 top 15 reasons why you get rejections. Now, shelf life. How could you possibly miss on shelf life? Well, you didn't include it. Why didn't you include it? Because you didn't have the data yet. You thought you could submit something early without any shelf life data because you haven't passed your validation yet, and you thought they would hopefully get by the RTA process. Well, the FDA's figured out that trick, and so 54% of the submissions get rejected because you don't have shelf life data included in your submission. So don't even bother. Just go ahead and submit it when you have the data. You need it. They require it. So one of the things that you'll know here is most of the submissions get rejected the first time through, more than 50%. It's not a lot more than 50%, but it's more than 50%. The second time through, most of them make it through, except in the dental branch where they tend to allow more than one rejection in the RTA process. The second time through, they figure if you've provided additional information and you've resubmitted, if they still need more information, they still don't feel it's worthy, they're going to let the person that's the reviewer ask. And now you're going to wait 45 days for them to tell you, oh, we need additional information, and we're going to stop the clock. So you would have been much better off just responding to the RTA right away with everything they asked for, so you have a fighting chance to get to that 60-day point with an interactive review instead of requests for more information. But these odds are not great. 58%, 56%, those are not where you want to be. So you want to be one of those people that gets through the first try. And if you fill out that RTA checklist, like I said, you will get through first time. Both the consultants that I've worked with in the last 6 months on submissions, both of them got it through first try and have had great success, and one of them is in interactive review right now. So now we get into product classification. Here is the link to FDA device classification, where I read an article about that. or a blog about that. Here is the database for registration and listing. And then there's also a link down here for the total product lifecycle database. These are FDA databases. The first one you want to look at is the classification database to try to figure out what class your device is. And I'm going to go through some examples, but you type in a keyword into the device description, such as adhesive, and it gives you all the device description names that begin with the word adhesive or have adhesive somewhere in the name of the description. You could also do it for pediatric, so to give you all the pediatric devices with pediatric showing up in the description. Ultimately, what you're looking for is the best fit product classification that has a 3-letter product code. That's the classification code that you need, and it gives you all the keys to what the FDA expects for a submission. They might even have a special controls guidance document that tells you every single piece of information they want in the submission. Well, I guess the slideshow is making me move ahead here. I'm going to go back a slide. So the total product lifecycle database here, this gives you also the adverse events and recalls and all your competitor 510Ks that have recently submitted. It even does a Pareto analysis of failures of the devices. So this is extremely valuable information when you're developing a new product. Here's another way. So I already gave this example. So here you click on this, you get to the product classification database. So it's FDA home, medical devices, databases, and it's this specific classification database. You click on new search, and you type in adhesive, and this is what you get. And there are 42 records. It'll, I think, default to like 5 fields or 10 fields, but you want to expand that so you get the whole list. I think it'll take up to 500. And you can see we get a whole bunch of adhesives, but the one we want for this case study was topical adhesives. We'll cover that in a minute. Oh, I guess we're going to cover it right now. So topical skin adhesives. So if I had the makers of Crazy Glue, you might have seen them with a guy hanging from an I-beam from his helmet. If those guys decided to get into the medical device market and they were going to make a topical skin adhesive to compete with Surgiseal, they might give me a call. And so I wrote this up as a case study. It's a hypothetical example because as far as I know, they're not doing anything in the medical device industry. And they say, well, we want to market this product as a medical device. How do we do that? I would find the classification code. So in this case, the classification code is right here, MPN. Those are the 3-letter product code. And I showed you how I find it. I type in adhesive into that classification database. And when I go to that particular record, I find that they actually have a special controls guidance document that tells me how to test the product to make sure it meets the safety requirements and the efficacy requirements for a device that's a topical skin adhesive. It also gives me special wording for the indications for use and intended use. And if you're interested in learning more about this particular 510K example as a case study, I wrote that up as an article. But this is just one example of a fairly straightforward way to look up the classification code, find out how to write your 510K submission, what testing you need to do, how to write your labeling. And I cover it step by step, and I even do some screen capture. So that's really straightforward on how to do, how to identify a predicate device. And in this case, we knew who the competitor was. So, you know, it's this company, and the product name is Surgiseal. And so another way you could have done it is you could have gone into the registration and listing database and just typed in Surgiseal, and that would have gotten you there even faster. Here's another case study example. So in this particular example, we have a pedicle screw. Pedicle screws are screws that you put in the spine, and they hold bone plates in place, and they hold rods in places, and usually have some sort of a connection to the rods to hold the rod in place. But these screws actually screw right into the bone. They're called bone screws. But this particular system is designed specifically for pediatrics. The way we found this was we typed in the word pediatric, and we came up with a bunch of lists, and we looked at pedicle screws, and we found the product code that we want here is OSH. So this client, they're developing a low-profile bone screw for the spine. They've come up with a new way to design it so it doesn't back out, and it's a really cool design. They patented it, they want to submit it, and they type in this 3-letter product code, and they find 3 510Ks, and they pick one of those, and they submit. Wrong. That's not the right way to do this. What they should have done is they should have also, in addition to typing OSH into the product classification, going that direction, which only yields them 3 different predicate 510Ks from 2 different companies. Instead, they should have also gone to the registration and listing place. And when you go into registration and listing, or, well, actually, I think the example that I use here, the 90 predicates, I actually went into a third database. I went into the 510K database directly, and I typed in OSH as a product code. And it pulls up 90 different 510Ks with that product code. You can also go into the registration listing, and it may give me more or less than that. Probably a lot more. But there are only 90 510Ks out there, but when I looked in the classification database, it only gave me 3. So you have to be familiar with all the different databases that the FDA has and know all the places to check under every single rock, or you'll miss a ton of predicates. If we had done it the way I initially said it, the way we did it in the previous example, we would have gotten 3 predicates to choose from. Now we have 90 predicates to choose from. We're going to get a much better predicate selection that's much better. Plus, now we have a whole bunch of other places to look at for additional information, 510K summaries, indications for use. Some of those will be 510K statements instead of summaries, and I'll explain later what that is. When you have a 510K statement, you can submit a request for the submission, and the company has 30 days to respond with a redacted copy of that submission to you. And that's fantastic information that'll help you prepare your submission. So if you want to know more about this particular one, here's the link to my indication for use case study. It's a blog that I wrote, and I actually also did it as a webinar, so you can learn more about that there. Here's some strategic considerations. When you're trying to prepare your submission, you want to make sure that it's a legally marketed device. You don't want to just pick something that is just any old device that has been approved, or not approved, but cleared by the FDA. You want to make sure they're not having problems right now. They're not under a consent decree. They don't have a warning letter. They don't have a bunch of adverse events, and they're pulling it off the market. It hasn't been on the market for 20 years. That's not what you want. You want to know what the history of adverse events is for that device. You want to know that it's currently registered and listed. So you look on the registration and listing database to make sure. You also want to look at the intended use breadth. Potentially, you might come up with a second-generation product, a third-generation product. You might expand the indication for use to other parts of the body for your new invention, new diseases that you're going to treat. In those cases, you're going to expand the intended use, and you want to start with something that has the maximum amount of intended use. And if you pick the wrong predicate, you might pick something with a very narrow indication for use. And that's not what you want for your first submission. Because ultimately, you're going to want to use your own device as the predicate in all future submissions. And that's what I'll talk about when I talk about version 1, 2, 3. Also, you want to look at the technological characteristics and associated risks with each of those, because you're probably not going to find something that's exactly like yours. So there's always a trade-off between picking something that has the right in technological characteristics. Whenever it doesn't have exactly what you have to balance that with new performance data to show how it's not any greater risks, and it's not new risks that didn't exist in the previous device. And depending on how it matches up with technological characteristics, that could be clinical testing, which would be very bad and expensive, or it could just mean a different biocompatibility test, which is not a big deal because you're going to have to do that testing anyway. Now we get into the version 1, 2, and 3. So here's the advantages of having a version 1, 2, 3. So the first submission is version 1. Then you add on some features to your product, and it becomes version 2 of the product, the second generation, and then third generation. The advantage of using a generational strategy for submissions, where it's sequential submissions and each one has a couple more features on it, is it establishes a history of your company with the FDA. So you're, oh, they've submitted before, they did a good job of the last submission, we'll accept this one too. It also allows you to, instead of taking the big leap to the third generation concept, you can make little leaps on the way. So the FDA says, well, yeah, that's pretty close to the predicate device, I can believe that. But then your second submission, it's just a new version of your own product, so it's another small leap. But 3 small leaps equal 1 gigantic leap. And it's a lot harder for the FDA to make that one big leap because they don't know your device all that well. So making several small leaps in succession with 100 days of review for each one, that's 300 days. That's a whole lot less total than trying to submit once with a big leap, failing, and then having to start back at square one. Also, if your second and third generation products are going to need clinical studies to support the intended use, you can do those in parallel with the first submission. And the first submission will allow you to generate some early cash flow and establish some customers if you are a venture-backed firm and need to generate cash flow to grow your business instead of a going concern that has a large customer base already. This is what I covered this morning in a webinar that I did at 9 a.m. We were talking about the 5 things you do when you can't identify a predicate. So here are your 5 options as to what I'm going to do when I don't have a predicate device I can identify. So the first one of those is a clinical study and a PMA. That's a $250,000 expense that you're going to have to put in. And that's going to be a very long process. It's about a 2-year process. So that's not the answer you want, but that might be the answer if you really have a novel technology and it's a high-risk device. You may have no other options. The next option is a de novo submission. So de novo submissions, we're saying there's not an existing product on the market, but I think this is a moderate risk device, not a high risk device. And so I think the FDA ought to create a whole new product classification just for me, just for my product. Now, you have to do some convincing and write something very persuasive to the FDA, and that's called a de novo submission. And part of that submission includes drafting a special controls guidance document explaining how you think this device ought to be evaluated from a performance testing standpoint for safety and efficacy. Now, it is possible that you could have a de novo submission for something that doesn't have a predicate out there, but you don't think it's worthy of a 510K. You think it's even lower risk and it should be 510K exempt, or it could even be a class 1. And there are a few examples out there. There are actually 275 devices out there that are class 2 and considered exempt from a 510K. That's a lot of devices. So yours could be one too. So don't automatically assume everything's going to be a 510K. Think a little bit outside of the box and think, oh, maybe my de novo submission doesn't need to be a 510K. It can be a de novo submission for 510K exempt. So go for the brass ring if you can get it. Another possibility is what I like to call the Hail Mary pass. If you're going to do a 510K submission, you really don't think it's going to be a fit, but you want to try it anyway because it's the fastest route. The other alternative is a PMA. You follow the PMA pathway anyway. You start doing your clinical study anyway because you need that data for reimbursement. But you're going to try the 510K because it's only $5,000 and might as well try. Rather than, I might get lucky. That's likely to end up one of 2 ways. You're either going to get an RTA letter, so they'll decide within 15 days that no thank you, it's not going to fly. That actually would be a good thing because the response in 15 days is only a 15-day delay. The worst case scenario there would be you get a non-substantial equivalence letter at about 130 days after you've provided a whole bunch of additional information. And they tell you, now we think you ought to go the de novo route or go the PMA route, when you could have just gone the de novo route or the PMA route right from the beginning. So hopefully you haven't wasted too much time with the Hail Mary pass, but sometimes it's worth it. The fourth possibility here is a pre-sub meeting. If you're in the middle of developing a new product, maybe even early on in the development of a product, and you want to identify what the classification is going to be, identify predicates, you might have already identified a predicate and you're going to submit it to the FDA in a pre-sub meeting and say, could you please discuss our predicate selection? Could you please discuss our performance testing we have planned? You want to discuss some of your submission strategy with the FDA. They offer a pre-sub meeting to you for free. And so I actually have a whole entire webinar on just how to do pre-sub meetings. But that's a very valuable tool, and the FDA has a guidance document on how to do those. And the veteran 510K submitters, they use that tool a lot. The last option to use is a 513G submission. If you can't identify a predicate, ask the FDA to do it because that's what they do all the time, right? Well, I'm a little bit biased. I don't like this solution. But the reason why I'm biased partly is because this is what I do at the beginning of every 510K project, and I think I do it better than the FDA. The FDA takes 60 days to make this decision, charges you about $3,000 for it, and their decision is non-binding. I really can't afford to do that as a consultant. My decision has to be spot on. So when I tell somebody this is the predicate I recommend, I tell them any risks that are involved, any got-yas, any surprises that could happen. I tell them the over-under on what is the success chances of this, and I give them alternatives, and we discuss it, and we go ahead with a strategy. The FDA just says, here's what we recommend as a predicate, go with this. And they charge you money for it, and they take 60 days to respond. I don't take 60 days. I've responded sometimes the same day. So if you want to go with this approach, this is a lot better approach for a lot of companies to go with a 513G submission, because they think that the FDA is going to give me this answer, and that's what they want to do. Sorry about that, folks. But I don't recommend that. I think you can hire a great consultant that will help you with your submission, and they're going to answer these questions for you and give you the same kind of feedback the FDA did, even more detailed, and then they're going to help you with your submission. Okay, so next thing here is the this shows you the most critical sections of your submission. As I said before, the submission has typically 20 sections, or 21 if you include miscellaneous. Of those 20 or 21 sections, the most critical 5 sections are these 5: section 4, 5, 10, 11, and 12. So the first section I prepare is the indications for use, and I have a whole entire webinar on how to do indications for use and why I pick it first. But part of the reason is it's one of the first questions the FDA is asking is, do the indications for use or intended use of the device match up with what the predicate is? And if they don't, stop now, issue an RTA letter. The second thing that I think is most important is the device description. And as a consultant, I need that information, so I make sure that I have all the information I need to assess the technological characteristics and compare it with the predicate. So if I don't have a good device description, I really can't prepare that next session, which is going to be the substantial equivalence. That's the guts of your whole submission. It has a table side by side showing here's the criteria, here's the predicate, and here's our device, and here's how they compare. And you might even have multiple versions of your device. You also might have multiple predicates, depending on the submission. So the third most important section is the substantial equivalence section, and that's going to get a lot of revisions. It's very complex, and there are going to be some sections you can't even fill in until you have testing data. You might even do side-by-side testing data with your competitor's device. The fourth section is the 510K summary. The FDA has a special guidance document that they issued last year that tells you the format and structure of a 510K summary. You can do that or a 510K statement. A 510K statement says if you want a copy of our submission, we'll provide you with a redacted copy, so all the confidential stuff will be blackened out, and we'll provide it to you within 30 days. If somebody offers that option, take it right away and get all the information you can from them within 30 days. However, the 510K summary is what most people are looking for, and some of them are better written than others. The goal here is to provide the minimum amount of information to make the FDA happy with your 510K summary, and not so much information that makes it very easy for all your competitors to copy you. In the last section I work on is the executive summary. Why is that the last section? It's because I want to have my submission complete. I want to include a lot of key information there, and if you don't include all the models that are included in your submission, you don't indicate what the indications for use are, you don't indicate what your predicate is, if you leave out some of that key information, your executive summary is not going to be satisfactory either. And the FDA expects a lot of detail in these sections, so you need to provide that. And once again, RTA checklist. You might want to fill out one of those yourselves because it's going to prompt you for some of the things in this device description section that a lot of people routinely forget. Here's the new form. The link at the top here is the guidance document on substantial equivalence that the FDA came out with last year. And this right here is the flow chart that's new. They always had a flow chart, but this is a new one, and it has 6 questions they ask. This is 5A and 5B, so there's 6 questions in all that you have to, the reviewer is going to ask those to see, is your device substantial equivalent when they're going through section 12 of your submission. And here's the 6 questions. So the first question is it legally marketed? And so they'll check the registration and listing database to make sure your predicate's listed. They also want to make sure there's not any problems, like they have that company under consent decree or warning letters and they're going to pull it. Next is intended use. So they'll look at section 4 of your submission and make sure it matches up identically. And I actually like to spoon feed the FDA and give them exactly what the predicate device intended use is, as well as give them information about what the regulation for that type of device is in terms of what it's supposed to say for intended use to make sure it's very close to the regulation. Then we get into technological characteristics, and I'll explain more about that. And then there are going to always be differences between your device and somebody else's. Nobody does a perfect copy. And then you evaluate whether those differences are acceptable or not and demonstrate substantial equivalence with maybe performance testing data, animal data, or clinical studies. Like I said before, just having a 510K number for a predicate is not enough. You need to check the registration and listing database. It doesn't mean you can't go with an old submission that's no longer on the market because the company went out of business. I've actually done that. But if you're going to go that route, you want to have a pre-sub meeting and run it by the FDA first. Make sure that they're okay. There was no problems with that device that caused it to be pulled off the market, just the company went out of business. And if that's the case, you might be able to find an old unit, do the testing against the old unit and demonstrate it's the same, or get a copy of the previous submission for the predicate device and compare your data to their historical data. So those are some things you can do as an option, but you really want to have a pre-sub meeting beforehand so it doesn't get stuck in the RTA process. Here's the technological characteristics. So technological characteristics consist of materials, the design of the device, the energy source, and some other design features. And you're not trying to show it's exactly the same, you're trying to show it's equivalent. So differences, this device uses electrical, our device uses pneumatic. They're different, but they have the same issues, or we're able to show safety testing data versus an ISO standard for safety and performance of a medical device to show that it's acceptable and it doesn't introduce new risks that didn't exist in the previous device. Or it might even reduce risks and eliminate risks. So those are things to think about. But technological characteristics, people put too much time and effort in trying to match up the technological characteristics, and what's far more important is making sure the indications for use and intended use match exactly. Here's another concept that gets confused a lot. It's split predicates. People don't know what a split predicate is. They think, oh, there's 2 predicates listed here. That's bad. We're not allowed to do that. That's not the case. The FDA actually gives you, in their substantial equivalence guidance document, 5 different examples of multiple predicates being used. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. You have to have the first predicate use the same intended use as your device, and the technological characteristics have to be the same. You can't have one predicate has the intended use and the other one has the technological characteristics, but a totally different intended use. That's not allowed. And they give you actually 5 examples. They walk you through the examples. So here's some options where you would use multiple predicates, and I give you 1, 2, 3 options here. And if you go through that example that I have on substantial equivalence, that webinar, it walks you through all 5 examples. And the FDA's examples are pretty good. Here's the first one here at the top, hemodialysis catheter. The predicate A has the same extension design. Predicate B has the same tip design. So you took the extension design from one company, the tip design from the other, put them together, and that's your new and improved device that you're going to submit. So you list both predicates. Both had the exact same intended use for a hemodialysis catheter, but they had slightly different design features, and those are the technological characteristics that are different. And you can even show FDA pictures of the predicate in your device in that substantial equivalence table that you'll put in section 12. Here's another example they give you, example 2, where it's a fracture fixation plate. And so predicate A was for middle bone fractures. This might be for tibia fractures like I recently had. So you have predicate A has middle bone fractures. The other one, predicate B, is for bone tip fractures. Mine was bone tip fracture at the top of the tibial plateau, so I knew exactly what kind of plateau or what kind of fixation plate they were going to use. I even actually happened to audit the company that made it. And so both A and B predicates are listed for this new novel bone fixation plate that can be used for either type, but you're going to have to provide some new performance testing data. You might have to do some cadaver labs and show that it can be inserted without a problem for those patients in both locations, different size ranges. So you can have small patients and large patients. It's going to work well for all with different size considerations. So that's some of the information you're going to provide for that performance testing data to show it doesn't add new risks. Here's a third example the FDA gave you on laser handpieces. So they show 2 different types of lasers being used in the same device. So one's a YAG laser with a Q switch, and the other one's a I can't remember what the acronym is, the ND. But we have 2 different lasers, 2 different handpieces here, and we're trying to show that these have the same intended use. It's incision, excision, ablation, vaporization of soft tissue. So we need new performance testing data, and we might even we could have gone the single predicate route, but that might have been harder to get through the substantial equivalence we might have actually had an easier time here using two predicates that were more like what we're trying to submit. So in this case, they took that strategy. So the FDA walks you through that example. Here's another example. Example 4 talks about multi-parameter monitors. So at one time, they didn't have multi-parameter monitors. They only had monitors. So when somebody came up with the idea of combining two monitors, you have two different predicates. One does temperature, the other one does blood pressure, and now Welsh Allyn comes up with this new multi-parameter monitor that does both temperature and blood pressure. So you might have to show some new performance testing data, but you're going to show it's the same intended use as each of the two predicate uses or devices and the same technological characteristics. But there are exceptions out there. If somebody comes up with a new infrared temperature measurement instead of an RTD sensor, that's going to be a different technological characteristics, and you're going to have to show that the risks associated with the new technology are not worse. And primarily, you're going to focus on accuracy and precision of the device and making sure it can't shock somebody or hurt somebody. And last but not least, we have a temperature measuring urinary catheter. We're taking the primary predicate is the urinary catheter, and then in this case, we have a secondary predicate, not a second predicate, but a secondary predicate. And it's just for convenience. It's not the primary use, but it's a new intended use. It's to measure temperature. It doesn't need the same level of performance. So this is how they recommend handling this type of example, where you put in a nice feature. A lot of cardiac monitoring systems, they'll have calculators that are added in there, so somebody doesn't have to type it into a calculator. The computer actually does the work for them already. It might even spit out the answers of the most commonly requested physiological parameters that are calculated based on an input of, let's say, heart rate. So those are examples of a convenience feature that be added on. Here's another thing that you have to keep in mind here. When you submit this equivalence data for Section 12, you need the intended use. It needs to be in Section 12, the technological characteristics, all four of these things, and then the performance data. You're not going to actually put the data here. You're just going to tell the person where the information is. The intended use is found in Section 4. The technological characteristics are found in Section 10 under device description. Biocompatibility is found in whatever section that is. I think it's like 12. And then we have electrical safety. That's probably 17, and this might be 14 or 16. So there are a bunch of different sections. I think this is right here is section 18, 19, and 20 of the submission. So you have your different sections, and you're going to list the actual documents that have each of those pieces of information in this summary section, which is substantial equivalent section 12. So we're getting to the end of the submission, or the end of the presentation here, pretty much, where I'm talking about how we organize and manage our 510K projects for clients. Like I said, there are 20 sections that the FDA requires, and here's a link to the 510K format guidance document. You can create a template, so I provide here a link to a 510K table of contents template that I provide, and I wrote an article about it. And I even allow you to do a free download. I think the link for the free download's on the next page. The e-copy guidance, that's the link to the e-copy guidance telling you how to organize your electronic submission, all PDFs. And then RTA checklist gives you a link to that checklist and an actual copy of the checklist. So this is how you have to organize your 510K. You don't have any other options. This is the way you have to do it. But I use it as a planning tool. So I actually will take each line and I'll color code it, and it'll be red if it doesn't appear to be available. And over time, as I develop drafts, it'll move to yellow, and eventually it'll be green, ready for submission. If it requires a revision, so the company did a CE marking submission and now they want to do a 510K, not a problem. I'll review it and I'll say this is what's missing or needs to be updated, and I'll color code that as yellow. If it's a document that needs signing, they might already have a truthful and accuracy statement, but they haven't signed it yet. That'll be blue. They're going to sign that right before they submit, so I'll color code that one blue. And then green is submission ready. It's a PDF. I'll also add columns to the table of contents planning tool, and I do this all in an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't need a Gantt chart. It's just not that complex, because there's only 20 line items here. So I'll add a column assigning the team responsibilities for each of the sections. Or I might have more than one person working on a section if it's a complex section. And then I prioritize the task completion, and I indicate target due dates. So we make sure that critical path items are never in jeopardy of being delayed. So I try not to have the same person working on multiple critical path items. I try to have them not working on two sections at once if possible, if it's critical path. So those are some of the things that I do to manage the project. Here's an example of, so this was a gap analysis that we did. We used the table of contents tool. We performed a gap analysis. A company had already tried to submit, or not submit, but prepare a 510K, and they were like halfway through it. So I took the 20 sections, actually 21 for the miscellaneous, and I went through each section. I said, well, they don't have the cover sheet. They don't have a table of contents. Here are the yellow sections, so they need to make some changes. This one was okay. It just needed to be signed. This one was need to review in detail, but it looked pretty good. And I only did this in a very short amount of time. I think I only charged the client about an hour of my time for this. Actually, this particular one, I think, because I was going to use it as an example, I did this one free. But it didn't take me very long. I went through this really quickly. And like, they didn't have sterilization shelf life data, and it was a sterile product. They didn't have biocompatibility data. All they had was it's made out of biocompatible materials. That presents a challenge. They didn't have benchtop testing data. They knew they wouldn't need this data, but they didn't have this data at all. So this is how I prepared this for them. And then we indicated like which items the client was going to prepare, which ones I was going to prepare, and you might even have another consultant added on here as well. We also have target dates. So after I prepared this, then the client and I met on the phone, and then we met in person out at 10X, and we went through this and came up with, here's the target dates for completing these. So if you're interested in more about this case study, go there. If you're going to manage a project with multiple people working on it, whether it's internal or external or both, you're going to want to assign the different sections. And these sections here are great for people that are new to the process because they're boilerplate. They can use your templates, look at a previous submission, and probably get it right 9 times out of 10. This section here on declarations of conformity, you might even need to split this up amongst many people because each form requires that you have some knowledge of the standard. So one person knows sterilization, one person knows biocompatibility, another person knows electrical safety. So each person that's going to fill out the form needs to be familiar with the standard. So that might have multiple owners depending on how many Form 3654s you have to fill out. And you only have to fill them out for all the ones that are recognized by the FDA. But even if it's casually mentioned, you have to fill out the form. That's a common RTA item. Biocompatibility and sterility, a lot of times those get combined together. I'll have one person work on those. Software and electrical magnetic compatibility, I'll usually put those together. A lot of people can handle both of those together, are electrical E&M experts. Then we have labeling. That'll be a separate section. A lot of times I want that to be one of the first section that's worked on because it really has to match up with the intended use of the device that we're going to put in section 4 at the beginning of the project. And these are the last sections that ever get done because they take so long to do the testing. So you want to plan those. They're all going to be critical path. You want to plan them up front, figure out who's responsible for them, and make sure nothing slows them down. You start those first and then backtrack to the others that are not critical path. One of the things you want to look for right up front on a project is make sure you look for any special controls guidance documents. That'll save you a lot of work. You want to look for any device-specific standards, like this is one for titanium, I believe. So there's an ASTM standard the FDA recognizes for titanium. You can use that instead of doing biocompatibility testing. And then review each of the possible 510K summaries very carefully because they may list a whole bunch of testing that you weren't aware of. That's pretty common for that type of device. And you're going to use their device as a predicate, you should know what testing they did. And then order previous 510K submissions, not just for your predicate, but all the ones in that product classification through the Freedom of Information Act, or if they have a 510K statement, you use that process. But you want to get as many of those 510K submissions as possible. For bench testing, here's the different types of bench testing you might do. Finite element analysis is something that's done all on the computer, so it's not cheap, but at the same time, it can be done very quickly and reiterative as you make changes to your design. This gets very expensive, so you usually leave this for the end, and you might have some validation tools if you have hardware or software. So you put in a known set of data and expect a known output. We have animal studies. There are even some special controls guidance documents that specify how many animals and what testing needs to be done and tell you to do side-by-side testing with a predicate device. So that's very common for things like sutures. So you might want to look at animal testing requirements and figure out what animals are acceptable, which ones aren't. And then we have human studies. Human studies for 510K submissions with clinical studies, they're not all that common. It's 10 to 15% of the submissions. They get very expensive, but they are required, and sometimes you're doing it because you want to make a new intended use statement or a claim that nobody else can make. And so that's something you want to look at. And some of these might be non-significant risk studies you can do under GCPs or good clinical practices. Some might require a formal IDE or investigational device exemption approval by the FDA. But no matter what, all human studies require IRB approval. If it's done outside the U.S., the FDA has a new guidance document they're working on for outside the U.S. studies. You don't have an IDE approval because it's outside the U.S., but you still need to make sure that you're following GCPs, otherwise it's not going to be acceptable data. Next we have the FDA PreSub Meeting. So this is another option for you folks that are thinking about submitting, but you have some questions about your strategy, about the predicate, about what testing they're going to accept. You have something different. Well, the FDA came out with a guidance document in February of last year, and it talks about PreSub meetings. We never used to call them that before. We would just ask for a teleconference with the FDA, or we'd pick up the phone, or we'd shoot an email. Now they have a very formal process for it and what you have to submit, and they track them. But it's free. This is a free process. If you want to learn about pre-subs, go here. I have a webinar just on pre-subs telling you best practices, how to do them. You can also, the number one thing I can't emphasize enough here when you talk about pre-subs, do your homework first. Do not go into the FDA and say, what predicate do you think I ought to use? That's not what they're willing to answer during a pre-sub meeting. What they are willing to do is give you feedback on the predicate you selected and why. They're willing to give you feedback on the testing plan for your performance testing, benchtop, animal, and clinical. They're not willing to tell you how to do it. You ask a rookie mistake question like, how many patients should I do for a clinical study? You're going to get the same answer everybody does. You need a double-blind study with 300 patients and a positive and negative control, because that's the worst-case scenario study. They're going to be very conservative rookie answers if you ask rookie questions. You come to them with a clinical synopsis that says, I want to do 76 patients. Here's my biostatistician's analysis of the power study that I need to do for these particular claims based on this data. Here's the controls we want to use. We don't want to do a double-blind study. Here's the gold standard that we want to compare the data against. Now you're going to get some intelligent responses from the FDA instead of a rookie answer. Okay, we're basically at the end of our presentation now. If you need additional resources, once again, call me here with questions, email me, put 510K tips in the subject line, and if you want to get this on your own for free, 17 blogs for free on the website and counting. I keep on writing them, and I didn't even realize, I thought I only had 3 webinars, but as of today I have 5 webinars now that are available on demand. So it just keeps on growing. And with Joe's today, that'll be 6. So there are a lot of webinars that are available on demand for people. And as you can see from some of the topics, this is predicate device, this is pre-sub meetings, substantial equivalence, that's section 12 of the submission, section 4, indication for use, and then project management. So those might be really helpful to your team that are doing 510Ks. Off to Joe.
Rob, I've taken myself off mute. I just shared with the entire audience a link for the slides you just presented, as well as links to your previous presentation with us about medical device auditing, a link to the QARA group, and to the Medical Device Academy website. So that's available for you all now. And now with the questions. So it's 5 minutes to the top of the hour. For those of you who are on a tight schedule and have to leave, no worries. We are recording all of this, and we will make the replay available. And in a week or two's time, I'll have a transcript of the entire call for your use as well. On with the questions. Pedro is first. Does FDA trust the information submitted for substantial equivalence, or do they actually challenge it?
Whenever you have a substantial equivalence section, that's section 12 of your submission, you're going to reference reports. The reports are going to reference the test method used, the lot numbers used, the calibrated devices, all these things that are required to do any kind of performance testing for safety or efficacy that need to be in those reports. Sometimes the reports are required, sometimes they're not. In the case of sterilization, they're not required. If you provide sufficient amount of summary data, we use this ISO standard, we tested this many samples, we used this, then they know how you did it, what standard you did it to, and there should be no questions. They're going to sample that during follow-on inspections after you market the product on commercially, but they're not going to require that sterilization data. There are some green reviewers that are very inexperienced that will ask for the sterilization data, but they shouldn't be. If you provided what you are supposed to provide and it's a traditional sterilization method, they shouldn't ask that. They shouldn't question it. If it's a non-traditional sterilization method, the FDA has a special pathway for those people. If it's a unique, innovative, novel sterilization pathway, they're actually going to require an on-site pre-approval inspection for your 510K, where they're going to actually come on-site and review your sterilization process before they even make a decision. So for those of you out there using new technologies like UV, UV light, that would be nitrogen dioxide, something like that, formaldehyde, any of those methods, you're going to have a rough road, but the FDA's got a guidance document for it. If you've got performance testing data like on blood pressure, you're going to have ISO standards, ASTM testing standards, special controls guidance documents. If you follow those and you use either your own lab internally, which you're allowed to do, or you use a third-party lab that's reputable, you're not going to have a problem. People should be using ISO standards and ASTM standards whenever they can, following the special controls guidance document. But the FDA likes to accept the data. They don't challenge anything unless you didn't follow an established method and there was one available. If you didn't follow an established ASTM standard and that's what they expect and you decide to come up with your own, well, they're going to have questions, of course. But if you followed, like for shelf life, if you did peel testing, and that's required for a Tyvek pouch, and you follow the ASTM test method, and you slit 1 inch, and then you did a peel test on an Instron, and here's the trend data, and it meets all the acceptance criteria, that's going to be normal. They're not going to question it. It's the oddballs that they question, the people that decide to come up their own way of doing things. Those take a little longer, and they ask for more requests for information. They ask for test method validation. They ask for a protocol. They ask for a final report. They ask for certification of the lab, because it's different. If it's NAMSA and they did biocompatibility, there's no questions. Next.
Yes, and I suspect you'll be hearing from Pedro because he has 4 or 5 follow-up questions. So I don't know if we're going to get to all those. We have quite a queue here. So next up, Shri Kumar asks, what if my device consists of components that have separate comparative devices?
That would be one of those multiple predicate examples that the FDA provided. The MultiParameter Monitor being the most common example of that, where you have modules, and each module does an independent function, so each module is considered a component, and each one has its own intended use, and each one will probably have its own predicate with its own technological characteristics, and some companies like Philips have taken this to an art form where it's just like mix and match your module however you want it. We got a 510K for it. So for those companies that have that kind of a device, there's already an established route for doing that, and it's definitely an example that's provided in their guidance document. When you run into challenges is when, let's say you have 4 different functions, 4 different components, and 3 out of the 4 have a predicate. That's when you need somebody's help. And I'm actually working on one of those now where, 3 of the components are definitely a great candidate for a 510K and have a pretty logical 510K predicate. But the 4th one is out there, and we might have to do a de novo for it, or we might even have to do a PMA. And so the question is, do we keep that functionality out, do an initial submission of a 510K with the 3 functions, and then add on the 4th function as a version 2 of the product? So that might be one of the strategies we go with that product.
Thank you. A question from Dennis Matthews. If I use a different modality to measure a biological function versus the predicate, is this substantially equivalent? I might say that the new modality can provide new information not possible with the predicate.
With that particular example, you're going to get through the first 2 questions on the RTA question list without a problem. It's a legally marketed predicate. It's the same intended use, same indication for use, as long as you don't add on those functionalities that you say it can do, but no other predicate can do it. So you can't add those on right now. But then you run into technological characteristics that are different, and they actually have a question for that, and they indicate you may have to provide a rationale showing the risk benefits and showing the performance and risks, showing that the risks associated with this new modality don't create new risks that didn't exist before. So the example I think the FDA gives for this is you try a new coating. The new coating had the same risks. It had the risk of integration with the body, and it had the risk of biocompatibility. So if you show performance data for those 2 risks, show that it's equivalent in safety and efficacy, you're fine, even though it's a different type of coating, a different material. For your particular example where it's modality, you're going to have to show accuracy and precision. You're going to have to show response time. You're going to have to show where it's going to be measured on the body. A great example, you take a mercury thermometer and you shove it in somebody's mouth, that has one set of risks associated with it. You take an infrared thermometer and you monitor somebody's temple without touching them, or just a surface contact instead of going inside the oral cavity, a whole different set of risks, and they're actually lower risks. That's why the companies that developed infrared monitoring for temperature were able to get a new modality through a 510K process. And so it's not that you can't do it, it's just that you have to be fairly savvy in understanding what the risks are of the existing modalities versus your new modality, and show that there's not inherently more risk here, there's less or equivalent risks, and some of the performance testing data is going to be almost the same tests. And so you have gold standards to compare. I test this patient with a mercury thermometer, and I test it with our new infrared thermometer, and I get the same reading within 1/10 of a degree, and I claim plus or minus 2 degrees, I'm going to be in great shape. But if I try to claim something that's more precise than the predicate, I'm going to have a challenge.
This is a popular question. I see at least Eric, David, and Maya asked, would you help me understand the differences between indications for use and intended use?
Yes, the FDA came out with a guidance document about that. They don't do a really good job, like in a definition, saying what the difference is, but intended use, I'll give you the example the FDA used in their draft that nobody liked, but the draft said in intended use would be bone fracture fixation. So I'm going to try to heal Rob's broken knee, and I'm going to put the 2 pieces of bone back together. That's fracture fixation. The indications for use are where we're going to put that bone fracture fixation device. Is it going to be in his knee? Is it going to be his elbow, his wrist, his neck? That's the indication. It's the specific part of the body. It can also be specific patient population. It could also be the intended user. So you might have one device that's an over-the-counter use. You might have another device that's only prescription use. You might have one that's supposed to be used by an EMT paramedic on an ambulance, and another one that's supposed to be used as an AED for the public in an airport. Those are 2 totally different indications, but they're both supposed to be restarting somebody's heart. They're electronic defibrillators. But one is designed to give voice commands to a person that knows nothing, and another one is supposed to be for a paramedic that's on an ambulance. So they're very different indications, but the same intended use. It restarts somebody's heart.
Next, Gao Ming asks, How do you tell if your device is classified as a 2, a 510K, or 3, PMA? Who decides, you or FDA?
Well, the FDA always has the upper hand in this one, but when you type in the classification database, your keywords, and find the right predicate for your device or right classification code for your device, it says right there whether it's a class 1, 2, or 3, and it says what the submission type is. So sometimes it'll say 510K exempt, sometimes it'll say 510K, sometimes it'll say PMA. Those will be the 3 types of responses you'll see. But just as last week, I got a nice curveball thrown at me. Call ODE, which means call the Office of Device Evaluations, because this one's weird. So that's when you call a regulatory consultant and ask for help.
Denise asks, my experience is when asking for a redacted copy of someone else's 510K under the Freedom of Information Act, that it takes significantly longer than 30 days. How long does it usually take to get a copy from FDA? Do you have any tips on how to get one quicker?
Well, there's 2 different pathways here. There's the there's the 510K statements and the 510K summaries. If it's a 510K statement, the company is supposed to provide it within 30 days. How quickly the FDA lets the company know, I don't know, but it shouldn't be 90 days to let the company know and 30 days for the company to respond. And we were just talking about this out in California at 10X. We don't actually have any stats on whether companies comply, and we don't know what the FDA would do if a company was late. So they're supposed to respond within 30 days. The clients that I've seen that do 510K statements, they do everything they can to respond within 30 days, but how quickly the FDA lets them know, we're not exactly sure. What I think our question is referring to more, though, is freedom of information requests where the company had a 510K summary. In those cases, the company is not required to provide it. The FDA is required to provide it. And if it's never been requested before, it can take up to 2 years to get it. So that's why I always ask for the 510K statement ones first, because the company is the one that's providing the copy, not the FDA. And I go back for the Freedom of Information Act ones later, which could take up to 2 years. If I'm lucky, somebody's requested it before, and I'm going to get it fairly quickly, but 90 days is not uncommon at all. And there are some services out there that'll get it for you as fast as you can get it, but you can also get it yourself without paying the extra money. But it won't be quick if it's a 510K summary unless somebody's asked for it recently and it's a good electronic submission. For the 510K statements, those you're going to get faster.
Kevin asks, please, what is your take on defining reference devices versus multiple predicate devices, which FDA is discouraging?
The multiple predicate, they're only discouraging it when you're talking about split predicates. They're not discouraging it when you're talking a multi-parameter monitor. For the reference devices, the example that I used in my presentation on substantial equivalence is where I was talking about a coating. You have 2 different coatings, and now I'm taking this coating from that we're currently using on knees, and I'm going to apply it to hip implants. Well, I might have an ASTM test method that's used for the coating integration into the bone for the knee implant, but nobody's ever done it in hip. I'm the first company to do that. I might have a reference ASTM standard. I might have a reference predicate device. I'm not saying that my device is substantially equivalent. I'm just saying the performance testing method that they used for the knee is an applicable test method that I use for performance on this new hip implant. Otherwise, it's a coating. So biocompatibility is the #1 issue, and the #2 issue is adhesion of the coating and integration of the bone. And I'm not going to use the test method that was used for the predicate. I'm going to use a different test method in performance testing data, and that's why I'm providing a reference device. But the guidance document on substantial equivalence that was published last July talks about what a reference device is, gives you an example, and that's where I would turn to understand that better.
Remus asks, what type of clinical data is required for 510K submission of a diagnostic device comparing your diagnostic device with a standard of care of an existing device. If that's not clear, the example is invasive measurement versus non-invasive diagnostic.
Okay, so there are a lot of layers to that particular question. For in vitro diagnostics, which is what this might be, you would have clinical data, but clinical data for in vitro diagnostics is typically blood samples, urine samples, and oftentimes there's a test method that is already accepted in a special controls guidance or is outlined in somebody's 510K previously. If we're talking about a device that is not an IVD, so let's say it's cardiac performance monitoring, there might be a gold standard method out there that's used where you do pulses and you can do the test in an animal model. So they might even say, you know, we did six pigs and we put it in the heart and we measured this and we saw this temperature difference traced for the pulse flow. We showed the temperature drop over time or temperature increase over time from this part of the heart to the other part of the heart, and then we compared it, our reference device versus our device, and we got the same result. And you might repeat it several times with several animals, but there's usually an ASTM test method, an ISO test method, or there's something out there already in your predicate that was used for that testing. But it's a lot of times it's animal testing. It's not clinical studies at all, unless it's a diagnostic measurement that you can't do in an animal. I think that's probably true for most of your cerebral monitors with MRI, and you're trying to use needle probes in the brain or the spine. Some of those are going to be really hard to do any kind of diagnostic without a human patient because the animals just don't have the same physiology. You're not going to get the same answers. But if they have similar physiology for like the heart, you got a lot of good examples out there for doing like EP or electrophysiology mapping of the heart in an animal. And so look at the predicates, see what they're doing, and that'll tell you whether clinical studies are required. If there's a clinical study, it's not going to be hidden in a 510K summary. It's going to be very clear that was required. And you don't see that very often. You see it on a few that have special controls guidance documents, and they indicate when you need it and when you don't.
Scott has a question. Do you include data in a pre-sub meeting?
Normally, if you have data, you've gone too far. You should have asked for a pre-sub meeting about 6 months ago. So that would be my gut answer to that, but to give a little bit more detail, it depends on what kind of data we're talking about. If we're talking about literature data, so I've done a clinical evaluation by the literature route for CE marking, and I've gotten a whole bunch of literature data, and I've done some maybe I've done some testing in cadavers on a prototype device and a couple of pig labs on a prototype device. If it's just prototype device and I'm showing what the risks are, and I've done a little bit of preliminary work, and now I've got a formal protocol for the final testing that I'm going to submit, and I want to get the FDA's feedback on that formal protocol, that's an ideal time to have a pre-sub meeting. But if I've already got all my testing data, and I've already done my 6 or 12 pigs, and I've already done a human study, you're way too late for asking for a pre-sub meeting. You might as well just submit.
I have to read this. It's not a question, but a statement. Lee wrote, "This was a, all caps, stellar webinar. Thanks so much for sharing this. I look forward to the link to the recorded event because I could not take notes fast enough. Thanks again."
Thank you very much, and I'm grinning ear to ear.
Sebastian asks, with respect to predicate selection, can we claim substantial equivalence to a subset of the intended use of a predicate when our device doesn't do everything that the predicate does?
Absolutely. That is perfectly acceptable. You can always go narrower in your indications. So, for instance, my favorite one, near and dear to my heart, I like to try to help companies out that are doing anything that's pediatric. The FDA does too. So they actually have all 510K submissions for predicate, or all 510K submissions for pediatric devices are free if it's pediatric only indications. So If you have those bone screws that I used in that case study example, and you're only going to make bone screws for the pediatric market, it's not only free, but you can have a much narrower indication for use than the predicate that might be adult and pediatric. But if you try to go the opposite direction and you say, this device only does this as my predicate, and my device is going to do more, I'm going to have broader indications, now you run into problems. I'll give you an example from I can only tell so much because it's a client, but a client has something that's going to be used for soft tissue approximation, so basically suturing, and they're going to use it in cosmetic surgery. They had a product that works in the face. They want to use the product in another part of the body, the breasts. It's a big breast surgery market out there. They thought they could do this, but unfortunately the predicate that they wanted to use was only for the face, and they couldn't find one that was for the breast. So they had to go back and look at other predicates out there that have broader indications than just the face in order to get the right intended use. As I said in the presentation, the intended use is really critical. Get that right first, then worry about your technological characteristics. Somebody's already figured out how to make something that's similar to your device, similar to or substantial equivalent to a suture, but trying to show that the substantial equivalence between intended uses when they're not equivalent is really, really hard. It's almost impossible to do if it's a broader indication. So narrower, no problem, you're good to go.
Terry asks, how do you see the requirements of human factors and usability in a 510K? How often does FDA require an HFE report in the submission?
Can you repeat that one, please?
How do you see the requirements of human factors and usability in 510Ks?
Okay, so human factors is not a brand new requirement. It's been around for a few years. There's an IEC and ISO standard for it, 62366, that you can follow. If you have an electronic device, there's also an IEC 6601 standard for human factors. Either one is acceptable, but the FDA has a whole entire task force just to human factors. So you really need to address human factors somehow in your submission. They're not requiring usability reports or human factors reports like the 62366 standard mandates, because that's a voluntary standard. But that would be best. That would be the best possible submission you could provide. If you can't do that, or that's more than you can do, you should do something to show here are the risks associated with human factors. And the best place to identify those human factors errors is look at the Total Product Lifecycle database, TPLC database, and see what kinds of human errors people have made before with predicate devices, and try to design those out of your device, put warnings of things. For instance, I'll take AEDs, the automatic electronic defibrillators, like the Zoll ones and DefibTech. You put those on a person and you're not an expert paramedic, you don't know where to put them in the right place. The machine has an automatic test function to test if they're placed in the right place before it shocks the person's heart. And so that's how they've designed human factors right into the device. Also, what if you have somebody that's deaf trying to use an AED? Well, they can't hear the voice commands. They can only read commands on the visual display. So it has to have both types of communication, both visual and audio. So it's two modalities for communication with the user. And so that's another example of human factors. Another thing would be the size of them. Do you have a pediatric one and an adult version for two different sizes to make sure it can be placed easily? A lot of people don't realize that some of these AD patches are hard to put on a hairy beast like me versus putting on somebody that doesn't have a lot of hair. You know, they're going to stick differently, and one of the hardest things with an AD is to get the patches to stick, and you can't hold on to it while you're shocking the person. So what do? So those are some examples of human factors, and FDA expects that data to be in your substantial equivalence section as a reference to where it can be found. You don't have to copy the data, just where can it be found, and usually it's going to be in section 18, which is performance testing for benchtop. But you might also have it in animal testing where you did a simulation on animals, or you might do it in a human testing environment where you do a human clinical study.
Cecilia says that, thank you, it was a great presentation. What is the average device development cost through 510K? And what are the scenarios about biocompatibility studies being required?
Could you repeat that last part about the biocompatibility studies?
Let's start with the first part.
Okay.
What's the average cost getting through 510K? I'm sure it's widely varied.
It is. We actually had this in the first 10X conference that we had. My co-presenter, he explained it well. He said it could range anywhere from $10,000 to $150,000. But the norm, the bulk of the submissions are between $20,000 and $25,000. For this is how much you're going to pay a consultant to prepare one. The actual 510K itself is just over $5,000 if you're a regular company. If you're a small business company, you've actually applied and received the small business designation. You're under 30 million in sales. These companies actually get about half that rate for their submission. So the submission cost is the small potatoes for 510Ks. The big money is hiring a consultant on the outside, but it saves you time, and if you've never done one before, it saves a lot of mistakes too. You don't want to have to redo all your testing because you made a rookie mistake. But even then, that 10 to 150,000, that's a huge range. Why do we have that range? Well, $10,000 would be something that's a routine submission. It's got an obvious predicate. It maybe even have a special controls guidance document, no clinical studies. It's really easy to prepare one of these. The FDA tells you what to do. And even the client can do some of the work. On the flip side, the $150,000 is going to be a de novo with a clinical study. And I have both that I'm working on right now. But if it's a relatively normal submission, maybe it has some electrical software, something like that, typically I see $25,000 as being a pretty much a mean quotation that I'm providing companies. And the way I do things, I do a lot of flat fee stuff. So I'll tell somebody, you know, this looks pretty routine. I've done my homework. I've done maybe a regulatory pathway analysis already for them. And we've determined this is going to be the pathway. This is the testing we need to do. And so I'll say it's going to take about 100 hours, $250 an hour, 25 grand. And that 100 hours is going to be spread out from the day that we talk about it and I give them a quote to the day they finish their performance testing. And we want to stack most of my work at the end of the project when they're doing the performance testing and just finishing it. Because if I start work on it too soon, they might change things once they get performance testing data that fails. So I want to have a fairly high confidence level that the performance testing is going to be done and successful before I start working a lot on the 510K, because if I don't, then we're going to have I'm going to have to redo some things. But there's always a risk of the project being delayed then. So sometimes we try to play this balancing act to start about 6 to 8 weeks before we expect to have our performance testing done, sometimes as early as 12 weeks before, and we start putting the submission together. And that way I can work on multiple submissions in parallel and keep them at a nice steady pace. And then at the very end, we're just waiting for the final test reports so we can submit.
Her follow-up
compatibility question again?
Yes, when are they required?
Biocompatibility has to be provided with submission. Sterilization test reports do not. So you indicate the method of sterilization validation, but you don't provide the report. You have to do the testing before you submit, but you don't have to provide the reports. For biocompatibility, you have to provide the reports.
Okay, we have two questions about RTA. The first is from Timothy. I've always included the RTA checklist, but in the past have modified FDA's form to include where in the submission the info is located. In the current climate, would you recommend this, or should the form be left unmodified? Great
minds think alike. I modified it the same way.
Okay, and then I have to find the second one. Fran asks, can you ask for a pre-submission meeting after receiving RTA and a 510K?
You can always ask for a pre-sub meeting. The pre-sub meetings take 75 to 90 days to get them to say yes and schedule a meeting. And you only have so much time to work with in your when you get an RTA hold letter anyway. So if I got an RTA hold letter, usually there's a phone number and a person to call. You don't want to do a pre-submission meeting. You want to just call the number at the bottom of the hold letter to ask questions.
Okay. 2 questions about special 510K submissions. Wynn wants to know, how do they work? Cecily wants to know, will an addition of an indication or an expansion of intended use require a new 510K, or can a special 510K be submitted?
For a special 510K, all it is you're submitting a new submission to the FDA for an existing device that you're changing in some way. It's a modification to your device. The FDA gives a shorter period of review time target than a traditional 510K. The traditional 510K is 90 days. The special 510Ks are 30 days. The reason why they allow for a shorter period of time is they say, we'll accept special 510Ks if there's only one functional expertise required. And what they mean by that is I don't have to have both a biocompatibility expert and a software expert review this. I only need one or the other, or I only have a sterilization aspect to review, or I only have a design tolerance issue to review. If I need 2 different specialties in terms of functionality to review the submission to make sure it's okay, now I can't route it through the review process in a timely manner to get it within 30 days. So special 510Ks are only going to go to one reviewer, and they're going to have the specialty already in their own possession, in their mind, so they can review it and make a final decision. As soon as you have to start involving a team of people at the FDA, it's beyond the scope of a special 510K. They will not allow you to do it, but they'll delay the whole process for quite a while before they let you know this. And then they'll convert it over to a traditional 510K. They'll ask for more information, a more detailed device description, and you'll have just wasted 60 days or more. So if you're in doubt, submit it as a traditional. It doesn't cost any more money. You just provide a little bit more detail that you should have already had from your previous submission. But if you're absolutely 100% sure that this is a special and you only need one functional expertise to review it, go ahead with the special, because you can get a 30-day time clock instead of a 90-day time clock. But it's a risk-reward. If you're wrong, you're going to be in for a longer than 90-day road instead of a shorter than 90-day road.
Completely expected. We're at 90 minutes, and there's no end in sight to questions. So I think what I'll do is we'll spend 5 more minutes. I think I'm just going to read questions to you. Maybe we'll make it like a fast round. I know there's no such thing as a yes or a no with you, but just to give the audience a sense of the questions that remain, and then, Rob, you can follow up with people individually. Keith wants to know, do they require E&L testing for all devices now? Give me a yes or a no.
I don't know what E&L is.
Keith, go ahead and let me know what E&L means, because I'm not sure either. Eric wants to know, is there such a thing as a Class 3 510K?
Yes. Automatic electronic defibrillators used to be. They've been converted over to a PMA now because of all the adverse events with AEDs, but I can't point my finger to one right now, but I'm sure they still exist.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Extractables and leachables.
Extractables and leachables would be for an implant device. There's a ISO 10993 standard for it, but it's only reserved for devices that are going to be implanted for a while, and or using new materials that you're worried about.
Do you happen to know what a while means? So if it's not for a while, no E&L testing is required?
Um, um, I'm working currently on a spinal product. It's going to be injected into the spine. It's going to be a permanent implant. They require long-term extractable and leachables testing as part of the 10993 family of testing. We got to look at extractables and leachables of syringe that you're going to inject with and a whole bunch of other things. So that would be an example of the kind of testing that they require for extractables and leachables.
Just a note, Diana says that pedicle screw systems are class 3. Dan says that his ventilators are class 3. And Keith clarifies that his question was about class 2 for E&L. Okay. Again, I'm just going to move on. Nash asks, if you require a de novo clearance for a device and the underlying technology supports diagnosing multiple diseases, does each intended use require a new de novo?
No,
or 510K of the prior?
No, you could have multiple indications in the same single de novo.
Let me stop you there.
Gets thicker.
Diana asks, it gets thicker. Diana asks, how do you know if you have selected the correct regulation when there are inconsistencies between the regs and the predicate?
Really? Inconsistencies between regs and predicates? I've never seen that before.
Said the sarcastic man.
Yes. What I tell people is in Section 4, the reason why my Section 4 is thicker than everybody else's is I actually include here's what the predicate says, here's what my device says, here's what the regulation says, here's what my device says, and I explain the differences. Because the FDA is going to ask. You don't want an RTA letter for something simple.
Christoph asks, at what stage of product development should you have a pre-submission meeting?
As early as humanly possible would be ideal, but honestly, you probably are going to be past the point of design inputs, but before design freeze. So if you know design controls, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Next, if an IVD is intended for use in saliva, but the predicate was serum, can we use the predicate for our 510K? Are they technologically similar?
They're going to be technologically similar, but I'm not sure that you're going to have the same intended use. I don't know enough about IVD submissions to know exactly what that answer is, but I do have a woman that I've worked with in the past. She used to work for DECRA, and now she's independent. She was out at 10X. She can answer that question in a heartbeat, so I can forward that question to her and get an answer for you. So
who is that, Allison?
No, Allison's expertise is biocompatibility. Connie.
Oh, okay, Connie. Next, Dan. What about combination products? Do we decide which FDA office is primary, or do they decide?
Everything goes to the document center, and they route it, but normally your product classification code determines which division is going to get it.
Next, Win. What advice can you provide if I want to submit a special 510K on top of my approved ECG device? For example, his approved does records and waveforms. His revised will offer interpretive analysis.
What was the initial question?
Is that a special, or is that a new 510K?
I think that's going to be a traditional 510K because you're adding functionality, and you're going to have to have a software expert for software validation, and you're going to need somebody who can evaluate the intended use of the device. So in performance data, it's definitely a traditional.
Okay. Next, Fran. If I identify
but that's my gut.
If I identify my device as exempt, but product registration and class, what is the procedure to register and be able to market?
If you identify the device as being exempt, whether it's
from
class
510K.
1, yeah, if it's a class 1 or 2 and it's exempt from a 510K, then all you have to do is go into the FURLS database, make sure you have your account for establishing the facility, and then you register and list the device on a separate database. Maybe it's the same database, but you register and list the device. That typically takes about 4 hours if you're doing it for the first time ever, and it takes 4 hours because you got to look up all this information about your company and finances and things like that. But the FDA provides a free webinar on how to do it and walks you through the database, and it's really not that hard. A lot of companies successfully do it in half a day.
Okay, two more. Approximate cost of a consultant for Type 2 PreSub Meeting, wheelchairs.
I actually did a wheelchair submission last year, and it got through within about 90 days. It was a tough submission. It included pediatric and regular. And so, I'd be happy to help. I would do it on an hourly basis, but your pre-sub meetings should not be anywhere near the cost of the actual submission preparation. We should be talking like a day of time. And it's not going to be one solid day. It's going to be a couple hours here for prep, a couple hours for a mock call, and then a couple hours for the actual call. And
I'm hearing not prohibitive.
Total hours, let's say it's 10 hours of work, $250 an hour, so $2,500.
Okay.
And you really want.
Where can I find guidance? Where can I find guidance on biocompatibility testings?
Biocompatibility is ISO 10993-1. That is the gold standard. There are tons of biocompatibility experts out there. Allison's one of the best. I have another one in Europe. Her name is Jeanette Van Loon. Both independent consultants, and but there are courses you can even take on it. And the FDA has guidance documents on it.
I'm hearing you say if you have a regulatory question, Rob probably knows most of the answers, but he certainly knows people who can answer the questions that he can't answer. Fair to say?
Yes, perfect.
Well, this was completely expected, Rob. This was a great webinar. Everyone says so here on my private notes here. And I'll thank you again for being a great, great resource for our group. Thank you, Rob. And be sure to reach out to Rob directly with your questions and comments. I suspect that it may take him a few days to get back as the response has been overwhelming. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.